The icy wind mercilessly cuts into the faces of people staring at the empty leaden horizon. The temperature drops every day, turning their breath into a burning pain. Supplies are running out, leaving only hunger and fear. The ship is stuck in the ice hundreds of miles away from them. Now they are completely isolated. The tragic expedition to Wrangel Island began in 1921. Its main goal, conceived by polar explorer Vilhjalmur Stephenson, was to settle and secure this remote Arctic territory for the British Empire. To accomplish this geopolitical task, 4 young explorers and a 23-year-old Inuit woman, Ada Blackjack, hired as a seamstress, set off for the hostile piece of land. The group expected to stay on the island for only a year, awaiting the imminent arrival of a ship with new supplies. However, the ship was unable to break through the ice, leaving the winterers without food for a second endless winter. 3 men went for help across the frozen ocean and disappeared without a trace, and the last explorer died of scurvy, leaving the fragile Ada completely alone. She had to learn to survive on her own, hunting and fighting the encroaching icy madness for the sake of her sick son on the mainland. Initially, the mission seemed like an easy walk in the park for glory, but no one could have imagined what a horror story it would turn out to be. The ship's hull slowly disappeared behind a thick wall of gray fog, taking with it their only connection to the rest of the world. They were left completely alone on a huge piece of land, lost in the cold waters of the cruel ocean. At that very moment, they ceased to be ambitious explorers and became ordinary people fighting for their existence. Wooden boxes with food supplies and tools were stacked neatly on the shore, creating the illusion of control over the situation. The men chatted cheerfully, discussing the priority tasks for setting up their future base camp. Their movements were energetic, and their faces expressed confidence in their abilities and the coming success of the entire grand mission. The world was too far away to hear their voices, but they still felt part of a great civilization. The dark ocean behind them continued to methodically throw heavy waves onto the rocky shore of the island. The water seemed thick and heavy, like liquid lead, ready to freeze at any moment and finally shackle the land. The sound of the crashing waves was monotonous and devoid of any emotion, reminiscent of the rhythmic ticking of a giant, invisible clock. From that moment on, relentless time became their most important and most dangerous enemy. That day marked the beginning of a long countdown that would severely test the limits of human endurance and fortitude. They still hoped that their isolation would be only a temporary inconvenience on the long road to glory and universal recognition. But the cold rocks of Wrangel Island promised them neither glory, nor warm welcomes, nor a quick return home. Nature was simply waiting for them to make their first fatal mistake in this completely unequal struggle. The approaching long night blurred the clear outlines of objects, turning the world around them into a continuous, impenetrable black abyss. The cold quickly forced them to huddle together, desperately seeking salvation in the warmth of each other's bodies in the weak fire. They did not know that this forgotten piece of land would become the last sad refuge on Earth for most of them. The story of their ambitions ended, giving way to a chronicle of slow and painful survival among endless ice. It all began in spacious, warm offices where the air smelled of expensive tobacco and fresh printing ink. A map of the world lay on a wide table, and the confident fingers of influential people traced a route across the harsh northern seas. The idea of occupying this piece of land for the geopolitical interests of a vast empire seemed incredibly attractive and easy to implement. It was an era of great optimism when empty ice patches on the map were seen solely as a challenge and an opportunity. The goal was to secure the distant territory for the powerful crown through continuous human presence. No one wanted to think about the real risks when new lands and eternal historical glory were at stake. 4 young explorers were chosen for this mission, full of naive enthusiasm and belief in their own invulnerability. Their eyes burned with a bright fire of adventure, which would soon be extinguished by the merciless icy wind. The group was joined by a young woman named Ada Blackjack, driven by completely different, much more mundane motives. She was looking for an opportunity to earn money to treat her sick child, left far away on the mainland. For her, this expedition was not a geopolitical game, but hard work for the sake of saving the most precious being in her life. None of the men imagined that this quiet woman would turn out to be the most resilient of all the expedition members. The contrast between their ambitious expectations and the impending disaster was truly enormous and tragic in its essence. They carried scientific observation instruments with them, as if they were going on an easy country walk in the park. Their luggage contained too little of what could really save their lives in the polar night. They went on a dangerous expedition for fame and money, but found only an empty and indifferent white hell. Talk of imminent success gradually faded, giving way to the first tentative discussions of the camp's real problems. The island greeted them with harsh silence and a complete lack of the abundant resources they had so recklessly counted on. Illusions quickly dissipated, leaving them alone with the cruel truth of the need to obtain food and warmth on a daily basis. And the price for any mistake made in these latitudes was always the same and incredibly high. Now stranded on the shore without a ship, they remembered those warm days of planning as a very distant and unreal dream. All their geopolitical ambitions crashed against the wall of permafrost, proving completely useless for survival. They quickly realized that they had greatly overestimated their modest strength and underestimated the power of the place they had been so eager to reach. Their grand plans evaporated, leaving them alone with the need to survive another difficult day. At that moment, they finally realized the scale of what was happening, although many were still afraid to admit it out loud. There was no turning back, and help depended on too many coincidences that they could not control. They still hoped to wait out the long winter, firmly believing in the organizers' promises to send a ship for them. But it was the kind of hope that did not change the harsh reality, only briefly delaying the inevitable despair. Waiting for the rescue ship became the main purpose of existence for every member of this isolated little group. Every day they scanned the horizon, hoping to see a dark spot that would turn into the saving silhouette of a mast. But the sea remained empty, covered with an increasingly thick layer of impenetrable and durable white ice. Summer navigation was over, and nature had closed the only road home with a huge and heavy lock. It was a critical moment, after which everything changed forever in their minds and daily routine. The realization that the ship had failed to break through the ice fields hit them like a heavy and suffocating wave. The ship was stuck somewhere far away, communication was lost, and the supplies they had left behind were rapidly coming to an end. Hope slowly gave way to anxiety, which penetrated people's hearts along with the damp polar cold. They still called it an unforeseen delay, but deep down, everyone already understood that it was a real death trap. From that gloomy day on, the expedition was finally over, and a harsh, primitive animal survival began. The team began to crack under the pressure of constant hunger and the impossibility of changing their dire situation. Some were already mentally saying goodbye to their warm homes, realizing that their chances of returning there were diminishing with each sunrise. The most dangerous enemy was not the storm or the frost, but the growing mistrust within the small group. Everyone understood that food resources were not infinite, and some were already subconsciously calculating who would be the weak link. They were separated not only by the endless icy desert outside, but also by heavy doubts inside their dark, cramped dwelling. Discipline began to crack when hunger began to openly dictate its primitive and ruthless laws. On that day, the real countdown to their human losses and the destruction of their physical and moral health began. This was not the end of their suffering, it was only the beginning of a real, unimaginably difficult and painful ordeal. Time turned into a thick and viscous substance that stretched on endlessly, bringing only new hardships. Nature did not try to kill them deliberately, it simply did not try to help them, maintaining an icy neutrality. Everything was decided here and now, in every calculated movement, every breath taken, and every bite eaten. A very long and terrible journey through the darkness awaited them, and even then it was clear that not everyone would make it to the end. The disappearance of hope was the most terrible blow, paralyzing their will much more strongly than any Arctic frost. They realized that no one would come to save them, and now everything depended solely on their own decisions. Every morning began with the difficult necessity of going out in search of food in the lifeless white wasteland. The men took their weapons and wandered for hours across the frozen ice, hoping to encounter at least a lone Arctic fox or seal. But the island seemed to have died out, hiding its few inhabitants from the desperate eyes of the starving and weakening people. Time after time, the hunt brought only disappointment and took away the last precious remnants of physical strength. The physical consequences of such an existence were not long in coming, manifesting themselves in a frightening and destructive form. People began to lose weight rapidly, their faces became gaunt, and their eyes sank deep into dark sockets. Frostbite covered their hands and faces with unhealing black spots, causing constant and exhausting pain with every movement. Weakness bound their muscles with lead, making even the simplest task incredibly difficult and time-consuming. Hunger became a constant and obsessive companion that did not let up during the day or during the short hours of restless sleep. Their stomachs cramped with painful spasms, and their minds refused to focus on anything but thoughts of food. The first visual hallucinations began when shadows on the snow seemed like animals, provoking false hope. Each time the hunters returned empty-handed, it was met with heavy and doomed silence in the dark tent. Ada continued to do her job, repairing worn clothing with her uncooperative, frost-bitten fingers. Her skills were critical to keeping them warm, but even she couldn't sew them new food. She watched silently as strong men turned into frail shadows, unable to change the course of events. Her own body was also weakening, but the thought of her distant son kept her moving the needle every day. With each passing day, the hope for a successful hunt grew thinner and thinner, until it finally dissolved into the icy fog. The surroundings seemed dead, not a single sound breaking the silence, except for the crackling of ice breaking in the cold. They stopped wasting calories on conversation, saving their breath and strength for more important activities. The silence in the camp became heavy and oppressive, foreshadowing the imminent conclusion of this protracted human tragedy. Fatigue accumulated in their bones, turning getting out of bed in the morning into a real feat of willpower. Diseases began to penetrate their weakened bodies, meeting no resistance from their immune systems. Scurvy, the terrible scourge of all polar explorers, began to destroy their gums and joints, bringing new suffering. It was a slow destruction against which they had neither medicine nor life-saving fresh vitamins. At that moment, they finally ceased to be a crew and became a group of doomed survivors. The question was extremely clear and cruel. They had to send people for help across the unstable ocean ice. The risk was enormous, but it offered at least a glimmer of hope that someone on the mainland would remember them. They began to gather their remaining strength and supplies for this crazy and desperate leap into the unknown. The decision to seek rescue by crossing the ice to the distant Siberian coast was dictated by sheer desperation. The three strongest men gathered a minimum of supplies, knowing that every extra gram would be a deadly burden. They took a sled, meager food supplies, and weapons, hoping to cover dozens of miles across the dangerous frozen ocean. It was their only and last chance to outwit fate and escape the icy trap of Wrangel Island. The farewell was short and devoid of any unnecessary sentimentality, as the frost did not encourage long speeches. Ada and one sick man, who remained in the camp, saw them off with dull looks full of anxiety and fear. The trio of explorers slowly disappeared into the white mist, turning into small black dots on the endless horizon. After their departure, the island seemed even more deserted, and the silence became truly deafening and ominous. No one knew what lay ahead among the piles of ice ridges and treacherous ice cracks hidden by snow. The ice was constantly moving under the influence of invisible currents, breaking and forming insurmountable high white obstacles. The path to the mainland was a veritable labyrinth of death, where one wrong step led to death in the icy water. They set off into the storm, believing in their luck and the strength of their youth, of which there was very little left. They were left alone on the entire island, cut off from humanity by an insurmountable ocean barrier. On that day, a new stage of their ordeal began, requiring superhuman fortitude from the fragile young woman. From that moment on, the expedition turned into the slow demise of two tiny human beings forgotten by the whole world. The disappearance of their companions became the point of no return, after which their illusions were finally shattered by cruel reality. They were doomed to a lonely struggle, where the prize was just another painful and cold day. History was already unfolding according to the darkest scenario imaginable in the North. Life in the camp after the group's departure turned into endless torture of waiting and growing physical helplessness. The remaining man, Lorne Knight, began to weaken rapidly as scurvy finally took hold of his emaciated body. His joints swelled and turned black, causing unbearable agony with the slightest movement on the cold bed. He could no longer go hunting or help with the chores, becoming completely dependent on the help of others. The entire burden of providing food and warmth for the camp fell on the fragile shoulders of an untrained Inuit seamstress. Ada had to learn to shoot a rifle to try to get at least a little fresh meat for the sick man. The recoil from the shots left terrible bruises on her shoulders, and the frozen metal burned her palms mercilessly. She did what she had never done before, because to stop meant death for both of them. She cared for the sick man with remarkable fortitude, giving him the best pieces of the meager supplies she managed to obtain. Her own body was also on the verge of exhaustion. Her hands were shaking, and dark circles often floated before her eyes. But she forced herself to get up every morning because her sense of responsibility proved stronger than her physical weakness. It was not heroism in the classical sense, but a stubborn and blind will to prolong existence. The days merged into one endless gray stream, where there was no joy, no rest, no glimmer of bright hope. They no longer counted the days of the week. They only counted the remaining cartridges and handfuls of precious edible grain. The expectation of rescue became a background thought that gradually lost its former sharpness and importance. The main task was simply to survive the current night and not let the fire go out completely. At that moment, Ada still hoped that a miracle was possible and that at least one human silhouette would appear on the horizon. But reality was unyielding. No one knew about their condition, and no one was rushing to their aid. She was completely alone against a ruthless universe, armed only with an old rifle and love for her distant son. And this fragile armor proved to be stronger than any grandiose plans and theoretical calculations of the expedition organizers. The situation deteriorated slowly but steadily, like a giant ice spiral closing in around them. They were at the bottom of despair, where there was no room for illusions or empty words of comfort. Each new day was worse than the last, taking away their strength drop by drop and bringing the moment of inevitable parting closer. It was the end of their joint survival and the beginning of a completely new, even more frightening chapter for her alone. Lorna Knight's last days were filled with unrelenting torment that could not be alleviated by any means. Scurvy had completely destroyed his body. Internal bleeding was sapping his last strength, and his breathing had become wheezy and rare. He was practically unconscious, sinking into a dark abyss of delirium, where he called out to his family and friends. Ada sat nearby, helplessly watching as life drained, drop by drop, from the once strong male body. From that moment on, time stopped for her, losing its usual meaning and division into weeks and months. She no longer counted the days that had passed. She only counted her tiny and ghostly chances of survival. This day became the first day of her real, absolute, and incomparable human ordeal. She was a simple woman whom no one had prepared for total loneliness on an uninhabited polar island. But it was in her that the primal force that allows a living being to cling to life was hidden. She was not going to give up, even though she understood the hopelessness and absurdity of her current tragic situation. Nature took the life of the last man, proving its absolute and unconditional power over this place. The icy winds seemed to celebrate its victory, bringing another fierce and impenetrable snowstorm to the camp. But for Ada, this death was a turning point, when fear gave way to cold and harsh determination. She had to survive for her son's sake, and this motivation proved stronger than any Arctic frost. No one knew if her mind could withstand the test of absolute silence and icy stillness. But she kept moving because to stop would mean admitting defeat and dying like the others. From that day on, absolute isolation became her only constant and invisible companion in this empty world. The absence of any human sounds weighed on her eardrums more heavily than the strongest atmospheric pressure drop. She began to talk aloud to herself, simply to break the dead vacuum with the sound of her own trembling voice. It helped her to preserve what remained of her sanity when her brain began to panic from the complete absence of external stimuli. The most terrifying enemy in this new state was not hunger, but an all-consuming, viscous, dark despair. Thoughts that she would remain here forever poisoned her mind like a slow and deadly organic poison. She woke up at night from her own screams, haunted by terrifying nightmares of dead people in endless snow. Her psyche tried to protect itself by creating complex illusions that help was close, and she just needed to wait a little longer. Sometimes she would walk to the ocean shore and stare for hours at the endless piles of dead, heavy ice. At those moments, her loneliness felt especially acute, causing physical pain somewhere deep in her chest. She understood that beyond the ice, the world continued its usual life, with people laughing, working, and loving. But for her, time had stopped, turning into one endless, frozen point in space. She kept a diary, carefully recording her thoughts on scraps of paper with a frozen stub of a simple pencil. These notes were her only message to the world, proof that she existed and fought to the end. She built a small observation platform out of wooden boxes to watch for a rescue ship from afar. She spent hours there, peering at the horizon until her eyes began to water from the bright, snowy light. At that moment, no one would have recognized her as the quiet seamstress who had once stepped onto this rocky shore. Loneliness had forged her into a true and fierce fighter, devoid of illusions and romantic notions about the North. She became part of this harsh landscape, learning to accept its laws and submit to its merciless rhythm. She was no longer a victim. She had become a survivor, proving her right to continue existing every day. Each new day was an exact and tedious copy of the previous one, turning life into an endless Groundhog Day. Waking up was accompanied by aching frozen bones and the need to immediately light a saving fire in the iron stove. The wood collected from the shore from discarded driftwood burned poorly, producing more acrid smoke than actual heat. But this smoke was a symbol of life for her, a thin gray thread connecting her to human civilization. She became a skilled hunter by necessity, using traps and an old rifle to hunt rare polar birds and foxes. Each successful shot was a real celebration, providing her with energy for several more long and cold days. But there were also weeks of complete despair when the traps remained empty and she had to guard her ammunition more carefully than her own eyes. During such periods, hunger returned, gnawing at her stomach and forcing her to chew on the remains of old and tough animal skins. She struggled not only with nature, but also with the dark abyss of her own mind, inflamed by loneliness. Her memory played cruel tricks on her, throwing up vivid memories of a warm home, which made reality even more unbearable. This knowledge helped her survive, hiding from storms before they began and using clear days for hunting. Nature became her main and only teacher, whose lessons were always learned the first time through pain. It was at that moment that she realized her strange and frightening independence from the rest of the vast world. She survived where strong and trained men had died, proving that strength of spirit was more important than muscle size. Her personal war with the island continued, and neither side was going to throw in the towel. The island just waited, and she just lived, in spite of all the circumstances and the cruel laws of Arctic nature. The end of this endless nightmare came as suddenly as its very first, fateful beginning 2 years ago. A small dark spot appeared on the horizon, which did not disappear or dissolve, as was often the case with her mirages. The dot slowly turned into the clear silhouette of a real ship making its way through the summer ice fields toward the shore. The sound of the engines running was the most beautiful and unreal music she had ever heard in her life. Ada stood on the shore in her tattered fur clothes, not believing her own tired and inflamed eyes. She looked like a wild ghost of these places, a thin and tormented shadow that had survived against all laws of logic. The sailors from the rescue ship looked with horror and awe at this lone human being standing amid the ruins of the camp. They had expected to find dead bodies, but instead they found a living woman who had survived the most terrible winter in the history of polar exploration. Questions about the fate of the other members of the expedition hung in the cold air, with a heavy and mournful silence. She simply pointed to the wooden barricade hiding Knight's remains and shook her head quietly in response to questions about the missing trio. It immediately became clear to the rescuers that the ambitious colonization plan had turned into a complete and crushing human failure. Wrangel Island proved to be too tough a nut to crack for those who tried to subjugate it to the will of paper maps and empires. It was neither defeated nor victorious in this story. It simply shook off its uninvited guests. Later, other countries would claim this territory for themselves, but for Ada, it would no longer matter. This story was not one of great heroism in the name of science or the conquest of new important geographical territories. It was a harsh and cruel chronicle of the survival of one small person caught up in the wheels of foreign geopolitical ambitions. None of the expedition organizers took real responsibility for this tragedy, blaming it all on the unpredictability of the polar latitudes. Only one woman knew the true price that had to be paid for this mistake. Her encounter with civilization brought her fame, but that fame had the bitter and cold taste of Arctic ice. Journalists wrote articles about her, calling her a female Robinson Crusoe, completely unaware of the depth of horror she had experienced. She returned to her son as she had dreamed, but part of her soul remained there forever, among the howling winds. No warm words could erase from her memory the sound of breaking ice and the death rattles of her companion. Ada Blackjack proved that the strongest weapon against impossible conditions is not a rifle, but a simple will to live. She survived where death seemed the only logical and quick way out of the catastrophic situation. Her name is forever inscribed in the history of the North, not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of incredible human resilience. And this symbol is far more important than any flags ever planted on frozen and lifeless ground. The Arctic did not try to kill them quickly. It simply waited patiently and cold-bloodedly for its inevitable hour. It allowed them to make mistakes, to doubt, to fear, and to slowly lose their last physical strength. And in this cold silence lies the main and most terrible lesson of this whole forgotten, icy tragedy. Nature is never in a hurry because it always has the whole and indivisible eternity at its disposal.